Good evening, everybody. I'm Bradley Graham. I'm the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and on behalf of everybody in PNP and all the folks here who helped us at George Washington University, welcome. Thank you very much for coming. This evening's event is a joint effort by GW and PNP. The university and our bookstore have been working together for some time now, putting on a number of author talks. And I'd like to thank the GW staff for helping to make this event possible. I also want to thank all of you for supporting such talks. Like many other independent bookstores in the country today, PNP faces a very challenging marketplace, but we're actually doing well in large part due to the very supportive community of avid book readers here in the Washington area, and we remain committed to bringing great book events and great authors to the DC area, and very relevant books too. The book we're here to discuss this evening, Russian Roulette, couldn't be more relevant. With the nation totally absorbed by Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation, Michael Isikoff and David Corn have come out with a detailed account of how Russia sought to influence the 2016 election and the history of Trump's own involvement or attempted involvement with Russia. The book conveniently and ably weaves together many strands of what Michael and David referred to as the sprawling tale. It goes into Paul Manafort's foreign consulting transactions, recounts how the Christopher Steele dossier came to be, and chronicles how America's intelligence agencies were slow to recognize the extent of Russia's meddling, just to mention a few of the book's numerous storylines. Both Michael and David are veteran journalists, and both have been covering the U.S.-Russia saga as it has unfolded. Michael, who has worked for the Washington Post, Newsweek, and NBC News, is currently the chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News. David, who was an editor at The Nation, is Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones Magazine and an analyst for MSNBC. Each author has done his own book or books in the past. They've also teamed up before. Just over a decade ago, they co-wrote Hubris, which chronicled how the Bush administration, in the run-up to the Iraq War, sought to convince Congress and the public that Iraq posed a real threat. Their latest joint effort is a very welcome contribution to what remains an evolving political drama. And as we await the end of Mueller's investigation, a New York Times review called Russian Roulette, quote, the most thorough and riveting account so far. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael Isikoff and David Corn.
Thank you, Brad, and it's great to be here. I am old enough to remember many, many years ago living just down the street from Politics and Prose, a couple blocks when it began, not where it is now, but across the street. In that it was just this little tiny bookstore that I'd go in and roam all the time, and sit on the floor when there'd be an author talks. And now it's like this incredible national institution. So it's a thrill to be here. We're trying to figure out how we're going to do this, and
what do you do when you have two reporters, on the stage? And I mean, you guys don't want to hear us read the book.
That was my idea.
Because that's you can read it yourself, and we don't want to take away from that. But if you have two reporters in a room together, you kind of have three opinions, and we thought maybe we should each interview the other for a few minutes, and then let you ask us questions.
Grill us. Right.
So knowing the usual Politics and Prose crowd, I don't think we'll be for a lack of any queries later. But just in case, think of a question, because if there are no questions, we will start calling on people. So you better be prepared.
Yeah, right. So, so I'm going to start out and grill David. My first question to you is, look, the House, the Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee came out with their findings just last week after their year-long investigation, and concluded that there's no evidence of any collusion or coordination between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin. So what do we need your book for?
Maybe as the antidote. You know, and even today, Devin Nunes, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, who shuttered the investigation, sent out an email fundraising note to Republican and conservative lists in which he said, after a year of suffering through slanders and left-wing accusations, we have finished the House Intelligence investigation on the Trump-Russia matter, and we found no collusion. And that to him was a selling point for give me money. I mean, that really, I mean, and we can get very cynical about these sort of things, and Washington has become really hyper partisan, and I think the Republicans have particularly politicized this very, very important issue. But I have a hard time remembering ever an Intelligence Committee chairman, you know, closing down an investigation, then rushing out to raise money off the fact that he closed down an investigation.
Right. And I should point out that John McLaughlin, who was a character in our previous book, was deputy director of the CIA, had a really on-point tweet about this. He said, once the Intelligence Committee oversight was designed to be bipartisan and nonpartisan, really. And once it becomes a partisan instrument in which one side shuts the other side out of the equation, out of the investigation, you've lost the whole premise of congressional oversight of in the intelligence world, and that is clearly what happened here.
But to answer your question,
yes, please, please do. I noticed you didn't.
I was working my way into the answer.
Yeah.
One issue was, why do the book now? And it's clear that the House Intelligence Committee, and we don't know what's happening on the Senate side, maybe it's a little bit better, failed in what its key mission was, which was to basically tell the public what happened in the 2016 campaign, what the Russians did, and also what ties or connections or associations there might have been between the Trump campaign and Russian operatives or cutouts. And they really ran away from that task. And the reason it's important that Congress does this is because I'm going to tell you something that I think may disappoint a lot of people here. That's not Robert Mueller's job. His job is to not tell you what happened. His job is to prosecute criminal cases. And in the course of doing that, he will release indictments and maybe material at trial, if he gets to trial in some of these cases, that will inform us. He is not obligated to write a report the way independent counsels in the past used to. He has the option of writing a report that explains his prosecutorial decisions. That may be an expansive report, it may be a short report. It may
which is not necessarily a public report.
It may not even be public.
Right.
So
he submits it to the Deputy Attorney General, who's in charge of the investigation, Rod Rosenstein, and then it's up to Rosenstein whether or not it ever sees the light of day or not.
So the question then is, who tells the public? Who tells them the story? And we thought when we started out this, and actually it wasn't us, it was really our agent Gail Ross, who's in the audience there, and our editor Sean Desmond at 12 Books, who's not with us tonight, who said that the story is unwieldy. We live in an information age where we're all bombarded with a fire hose of data every day. And there's a lot of good journalism. This piece comes out, that piece comes out, this piece comes out. But there's no narrative. People lose track. People forget what they read last week in the Washington Post. And so putting together, as comprehensive as it could be at this midway stage narrative of the story and tying together the various threads is really something that the House Intelligence Committee should have done. They chose not to. They gave us a really big opening to do this. I mean, they said they're going to put out a 150-page report, probably with big margins. We have 304 pages right here without the power of subpoena. So, that's why I think it was necessary, and the response we've gotten from people who've read the book is just really so gratifying that they didn't realize what the big picture looked like. They had forgotten things along the way. And so we wanted to be, have the first telling of this.
So let's talk a little bit about the substance. The book starts out in Moscow in 2013 when Donald Trump flies there to preside over the Miss Universe pageant. But he's also there for another purpose, and I think
not just for the contestants.
Not just for the contestants. So what was going on? First of all, tell us, how did Donald Trump get to Moscow in the first place? Why was he there? And what was his real agenda when he was in Moscow in 2013?
Well, there are these, it really all begins with these two characters named Emin. He goes just by Emin, but his full name is Emin Ergalarov, and a guy named Rob Goldstone. Emin is an Azerbaijani pop star. I don't know how much talent you need to make it big in Azerbaijan, but he has the benefit of being the son of a Russian oligarch named Aris Ergalarov, who is a big builder, developer, nicknamed Putin's builder, because he's done a lot of big infrastructure programs for Putin. Rob Goldstone is sort of the opposite of the suave, rakish Emin. He is, as he often jokes about himself, a little rotund, very disheveled, a Brit who was an Australian newspaperman, went into PR, worked for Michael Jackson's Bad tour in 1980, whatever, and hooked up with Emin along the way, and wanted to make Emin's dream of becoming a big American pop star a reality. So they thought, how can they do this? They were making a video about Emin in a song that he wrote, Looking for a Beautiful Woman. So they needed a beautiful woman. Where do you find a beautiful woman to be in a music video? You go to the Miss Universe contest. They contacted Miss Universe, said, we need somebody, one of your contestants. That was arranged, but more importantly, led to a discussion. Why don't you do Miss Universe in Azerbaijan? People around Miss Universe said, nah, we'll take a pass on this. And then they had another conversation. What about Russia? Russia, well, we thought about that. A lot of red tape. Can't do that. No place to hold it. Well, Aris's dad owns one of the biggest theaters, Crocus City Hall in Moscow. And eventually they worked out a deal, which conveniently included the fact that Emin gets to perform not one but two songs in this worldwide audience. And when they presented the idea to Donald Trump, he loved it. For 30 years, he'd been trying to do a deal in Russia, build a big tower, never came through. Now he was partnering not just with a Russian oligarch, but a Russian oligarch who built things, could build the tower. And they had this very unusual meeting in June of 2013. The contest would be in November 2013 in a town called Las Vegas. And what happened there didn't quite stay there, because we write about it in the book. You tell them tell them about that, Mike.
Yeah, well, it was known that this is where Trump meets Aris Agalarov, the billionaire oligarch close to Putin. Emin, Goldstone, they go to dinner. You've probably seen video of the dinner, which has been shown on CNN elsewhere. What we report in the book is what happened after the dinner, when they all go to an after party at this really raunchy Las Vegas nightclub called The Act. And when I say raunchy, I mean really raunchy. It was under investigation at the time by the Nevada Gaming Commission for its lewd and offensive performances that were in potential violation of Nevada obscenity laws. So the idea that you could be in violation of Nevada obscenity laws,
I didn't know that was
gives you
possible.
some idea of just how raunchy the acts were at the act. And we discovered, in the course of reporting this book, there was litigation over this, and a judge actually banned its lewd and offensive performances and then itemized them, just what they were, and they included a number of performances, one which was called Hot for Teacher, in which dancers posing as college co-eds simulate urinating on their professor. There were a number of other...
Enough.
Okay, yes, I can go into other. But it does seem to presage some allegations that would come later. The point is, though, that from all accounts, Trump was mostly focused that night, sitting in the owner's box with Emin, talking about how Emin could be the key to achieving his dream of many decades of building a Trump Tower in Moscow. Because with Emin's father, Putin's builder, they could cut through the red tape, get the approval they needed. This was in Trump's mind, and he says this is going to be the start of a beautiful relationship, echoing the end of Casablanca, perhaps. So we get to Moscow, and what is Trump's obsession during the entire time he's in Moscow? Is he going to get a chance to meet Putin? He's asking everybody, is Putin coming? They had invited him to the Miss Universe pageant. Have we heard from Putin yet? Has he called? And Trump keeps getting reassured. He'll be calling, don't worry. Finally, Aris Agalarev's cell phone rings. Trump thinks it's going to be Putin. In fact, it's Dmitry Peskov, Trump's spokesman. They hand the phone to Trump. Peskov apologizes. The president is tied up. He has a meeting with the King of Holland and the Queen, who were in town that day. They got stuck in a traffic jam in Moscow. The traffic's so bad. The Russian, Mr. Putin is, really apologetic. But he hopes that Trump can come to the upcoming Sochi Olympics. And he hopes he has a chance to see him sometime soon. Trump is really disappointed, but being Trump, his initial instinct, he says to one of his aides, is, well, do we have to tell anybody that he didn't come? Why don't we just say he did come and nobody would know?
Now, an important thing here is that it was the Miss Universe and his desire to build a tower in Moscow is when we see Trump publicly showing this weird affection for Putin. He starts off by tweeting, "We're taking Miss Universe to Moscow. Will Putin become my BFF?" Now think about this for a second. This is 2013. Putin's been in and out of power, in one way or another since 2000. He used to run the KGB. He's the head of a regime where journalists and dissidents are routinely killed, beaten up. His parliament has just passed a bill basically outlawing the discussion of gay rights. There are human rights abuses in Chechnya. You can go on and on about the human rights records elsewhere. And he only sees Putin, I know this is going to surprise you, through his own lens of his own desires. And so, can you do business in Moscow? And if you're being critical of Putin? I don't think so. I also think it seems like he had a psychological affinity for Putin, as if he too wanted to be a strong man or an oligarch. He kept talking about, oh yeah, I don't care what he does, but he's a strong leader. He's a success where he is. But But, one thing we saw when doing this book is a lot of seeming curiosities or mysteries become more obvious. They're like hiding in plain sight when you put them.
And let me give you an
On the
example which grows out of this, because Trump immediately achieves, at least he thinks he's achieved his goal, because although Putin doesn't come, he does reach a deal, sign a deal with Agalarov to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. There's a letter of intent signed. They line up financing from a Russian state-owned, majority state-owned bank, Sberbank.
Which means he'd be in business with the Russian government.
Right. And so he's got what he wanted. And Donald Trump Jr. is put in charge of the project. And Ivanka Trump flies to Moscow in February of 2014 with Emin to scout potential sites for Trump Tower Moscow. The project is serious. It's on its way. But what happens in February 2014? Putin is annexing Crimea. He's intervening in Ukraine. He's being denounced by the entire Western world, which promptly imposes sanctions on Russia, the US and the EU within weeks of the annexation of Crimea. The first takeover of land from one country by another since World War II. What happens? Among the sanctioned entities, Sberbank, the bank that was going to finance the deal, and the deal collapses. We quote Rob Goldstone in the book saying that he believes it was the sanctions that killed the deal, that killed Trump's business deal.
That Trump believed that.
And that Trump believed that. And once you know that, you begin to see Trump's attitude towards the sanctions on Russia imposed by Obama. They screwed up his business deal. And one of the first things Trump says, he announces, we'll cut to a couple years later, 2015, when he announces his candidacy for president and starts off on immigration and Mexico and rapists coming in and all that. But very shortly thereafter, he goes to Las Vegas again, and is speaking at Freedom Fest, which is a conservative evangelical event, and
they love him.
They love him. There's a side story on that we can get to, but a woman named Maria Butina, who is a Russian woman who works for the deputy governor of the Russian central bank by the name of Alexander Torshin, a guy who's been under investigation for money laundering in Spain for years, and is also a lifetime member of the NRA. Anyway, she's in the audience. She just happens to be there, and Trump just happens to call on her. And there's video of this which puzzled a lot of people in the Trump campaign when they watched it. And she immediately asks about sanctions. And this is the first time Trump has been asked about it as a candidate. And what does he see is, if I'm elected, you won't need sanctions. He's on the record right from the get-go criticizing the sanctions that, and he didn't explain this in his answer, killed his business deal.
You should ask me what my favorite chapter is.
What's your favorite chapter?
Good question. Glad you asked. My favorite chapter, to move it story even more forward, is chapter 14. This is a chapter that looks at how the Obama White House responded to the Russian attack. And we've gotten used to calling it hack and all those other things. This was an attack. This was an act of information warfare. And the more we learn about it, the wider and deeper it seems to be. At the time, through the campaign, we knew about the hacks and the dumps of information from the DNC and then later from John Podester's email account. But we didn't know about the social media campaign on Twitter. In general, we didn't know, and Facebook. But in August of 2016, This is shortly after the material has been released prior to the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia. The intelligence community more or less has sussed it out. Russians did the hack. Russians are behind the dissemination of information through WikiLeaks, Guccifer 2.0, and DC Leaks, and strong reason to believe that Putin's involved. At least it goes up pretty high, and that the aims are to at least cause chaos in the election, probably to slap Hillary because Putin has a grudge against her for having criticized his elections when she was Secretary of State, and a possibility later became an assumption, an evaluation that was consensus, possibility that they actually wanted to help Trump win. So this is all known beginning of August. The White House, what do you do? What do you do? We tell the story of a group of cyber and Russian specialists in the National Security Council, which is within the White House, who came up with very creative options of cyber warfare and other ways of attacks to counter this, to send Russia a message. Like information attacks, such as taking intelligence they had about Putin's daughter's secret bank accounts in Latvia and putting them up online, attacking Russian news sites, attacking the sites that are leaking, and even like having a gigantic cyber war game targeting a Eurasian country that lies just east of Hungary or whatever. But basically saying this is what we could do to you. At the same time, Obama's cabinet, not all the cabinet, but like the Secretary of State, the intelligence chiefs, Defense Department head, and others are meeting and sussing this out. As they're discussing this, new intelligence comes in. And this is a story that Mike first broke about the same time, that not only are they messing around with these stolen emails and such, Russian hackers are probing state election systems. They're getting in there, they've stolen some data, and now there's a tremendous fear that, they can, on election day, before election day, make it a mess. You show up to vote, you're not registered, the vote count is challenged. There happened to be a candidate at the time who was saying, the only way I can lose is if this is rigged. So the Obama people are trying to figure out, okay, we don't want to do the Russians' work for them and cause chaos ourselves. So if we talk about this too much, does that cause people to lose faith in the election? Like everybody else, probably including the Russians, they assume Hillary's going to win. And so the attack on her and her campaign, they say that's secondary to the possible attack on the election system. We want to work with states, because it's not a federal program. But the states, a lot of them are controlled by Republicans. If we make this a political issue and talk about it too much, Trump will say, you're politicizing this, states won't work with us. And they go round and round trying to figure out what to do. There's an argument against cyber attacks, because we heard just the other week that, we didn't know this at the time, that the Russians had also probed electric power plants and nuclear facilities and had scared U.S. intelligence into thinking they might be able to shut it down. During one of these meetings, James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, says, well, if we get into a cyber war with them and we hit them back and they hit us back and it escalates, they might be able to shut down our electrical grid, which shows you how vulnerable we are, and that's kind of the big issue here, why that's even possible.
It's actually, in retrospect, one of the most frightening things in our book.
The president's hands were tied because of this.
Because we were so perceived by the White House itself to be so vulnerable that we couldn't, they were afraid to respond to what Russia was doing, lest Russia retaliate against us and cripple our economy, which may tell you all you need to know about the state of cybersecurity in our country.
But let me just make this one point, then you can add on to that. But to me, chapter 14 is really a "what would you do" chapter. Everybody in the book believes their perspective. The White House believed they acted as prudently as they could. The NSA people believe that it should have been a harder, more aggressive assertive attack. And I'm just, I think Avril Haines, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor working for Susan Rice, gave us a quote for the book in which she said this was the most vexing, difficult issue she had ever confronted in her years of government service.
Right.
And so to me, it's just an incredibly engaging chapter because it just shows you that the most powerful man in the world, in one ways, the president, had no easy course of action in how to deal with this.
Yeah. Now, but that said, I think as even senior Obama officials who talked to us for the book acknowledge that they didn't do as much as they could have done. There are those who believe that if you're gonna punch back at the Russians, it's not about statements, it's not about words. You got to make them feel pain, otherwise they will continue to do what they were doing. And I would argue that this came after our book, but the recent events in the UK underscore that as much as anything. Clearly, Putin felt emboldened by his ability to get away with what he did in the election. And by the way, we have we write in the book about some of the intelligence that the U.S. Intelligence community got after the election, in which the Russians were high-fiving themselves over the election of Donald Trump. They had achieved, whether their goal was to elect Trump or just to sow discord and discredit Hillary, that's a judgment that probably never be completely settled. But either way, they achieved their purposes. They got what they wanted. And what's the first thing that Trump tried to do once he took office, which was to dismantle those sanctions on Russia that he had talked about so many years earlier?
Just one point. You used the word emboldened, which I thought, when I hear the word emboldened, I think of the word collusion. Because, it's unfortunate. But that seems to be how this debate, and not even how the national discourse has evolved to whether there was collusion or not between the Trump campaign and the Russian attack. I don't think anyone believes that Donald Trump sat down with Russian agents and said, you hack this document and you release it on that website, and you wait until Thursday because that's the best part of the news cycle to do it in. To me, the collusion that is at least already known, there may be more, is already known, is that throughout this attack, and we got first public notice of it in June of 2016 when it was announced that the Russians had hacked the DNC, and then immediately information came out. Then you saw the dump a few weeks later at the Democratic Convention. But from that point on, most knowledgeable people and unidentified U.S. government officials in the media were saying this is a Russian operation. Throughout that period until the election, you had two things going on in the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign kept saying it was a hoax. Didn't matter. It was the Russians. It wasn't the Russians. It was the Democrats themselves who were hacking themselves to create the story. They literally actually said that after the first DNC breach. And of anybody, given that they had this infamous meeting with a Russian emissary who was sent their way by Veneris Aguilarov, with dirt on Hillary, supposedly having dirt on Hillary.
Communicated with emails by Rob Goldstone.
Yes.
Two characters from Las Vegas.
So and this was a meeting with Don Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner. They knew from the get-go that the Russians wanted to help them secretly. Yet they're out there saying, no, nothing's happening. And that evolves into Donald Trump saying it's a 400-pound guy in the basement in bed, which he says weeks after he receives an intelligence briefing that we write about in the book as a candidate, telling him that the Russians are doing this, sir. It's not a hoax. The Russians are doing this. So you have this pattern of denial when they know better. And at the same time, we have instances of foreign policy advisors for the Trump campaign, Carter Page and also George Papadopoulos, actively making contacts and reaching out to Russians. And as we report in the book, for the first time, Papadopoulos has told Robert Mueller that he was doing this, he believed, after meeting with Donald Trump at a group meeting, and Trump encouraging him to pursue this country.
Getting a green light from Trump.
But just get back to emboldening.
Right.
So the Russians, looking at what's going on from their perspective, they're waging this campaign. They can't figure out maybe what the White House is doing, but they see from the Trump side, he's denying what they know they're doing, like, whoa, thank you, comrade. And at the same time, they see Trump people saying, we want to be your friends. We want to have off-the-record meetings with you. You know, Jeff Sessions is meeting with the ambassador and not saying anything harsh about this. So, you know, to me, that's a form of, as we put in the book, aiding and abetting. Call it collusion, not call it collusion, but I think that portion of it has been washed aside by this binary debate that we see Devin Nunes and Trump and others trying to set up as the framework.
I think that we might have some people who have some questions for us.
Yes, and I think there's a microphone here.
There's a microphone here, so if anybody...
and we're going to ask you to be not as long-winded as we are, so we can get in as many questions as we can. So, sir.
No problem. I am short-winded. Yeah, you mentioned that you wrote this book without the power of subpoena. If you did have the power of subpoena, who would you subpoena and what would you ask them?
Wouldn't that be fun? Look, Mueller has an advantage over us because he's been able to talk to all the people, he's been able to require people to talk to him who we have not. David just mentioned we've got the first report on what George Papadopoulos has been telling Mueller's people. But there's a lot of others who have signed plea agreements to cooperate with Mueller's investigation after acknowledging they lied about their contacts with Russians. Michael Flynn, who was there at critical moments, advising Trump on everything to do with Trump, with Russia, and was meeting with Kislyak, the ambassador. What has he told Mueller's people? Rick Gates, who was Manafort's deputy, who just signed a plea agreement, pled guilty. He was there right up through the inauguration and in and out of the White House. What has he told Mueller's people? And what more has Papadopoulos has to say? So hearing what the people who have signed cooperation agreements with would be the first thing, you know, that I would do with my subpoena power. And just adding, I'll add somebody to the list because he's been in the news of late, Michael Cohen. We talked about the first Trump Tower deal. There was a second Trump Tower deal in 2015 while he was running for president that was set up by Michael Cohen with the advice of this guy named Felix Sater, a former felon turned FBI informant. Cohen clearly knows a lot, not just about the payoff to Stormy Daniels, but about Trump's efforts to do business in Russia.
And we could slip a question in about that. If
we might add. Yeah.
I'll just shortly add, too, that one thing that I'd like to know, you mentioned Michael Flynn. It's been reported, and not gotten a lot of attention, that Ambassador Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, said that he was talking to Flynn before the election. We know about conversations after the election, but before the election is really interesting because if Flynn is talking to him and saying, listen, you'll get a better deal from us if we win, we want to work with you on sanctions, while he knows Russia is attacking the United States because he too sat in on that intelligence briefing with Trump. That would be something. I'm not sure it's a crime, but that would be something to be talking to a foreign representative of a foreign adversary and trying to work with them while you knew they were engaged in this sort of assault on an American election.
Go right ahead.
So I think it's pretty obvious to a lot of us that there's a lot of financial backhanded dealing going on with the Russians and the oligarchs between Trump and a lot of the other people in his campaign. But it wasn't too long ago that the mainstream corporate media kind of was complicit in selling the Iraq war. Remember, yellow cake, weapons of mass destruction. So
It was the subject of our first
so it's
book.
good that you guys are
We wrote a whole
investigative
book about
journalists
this
and
subject.
asking tough questions. But
Yeah.
the intelligence analysis report here says, page 13, judgments are not intended to imply that we have proof that shows something to be fact. So isn't that kind of a little bit of an inconvenient truth? This is the intelligence community's report. They state it clearly that they don't have any proof.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you guys are going to address. Hopefully, you address that. In the
I'll address that. First
and
of
I have
all,
one more thing.
okay.
The Nation, which you were, I guess, the editor of, wrote the. You did read the article by the veterans.
Yeah.
intelligence,
Let's stick to one thing so other people can get to it. So let's.
Which
if you want
shows
to talk
that there's no
afterwards.
possible way the DNC was hacked by the.
Okay.
Well,
So,
that story is wrong,
thumb
but
drive.
let's stick to your first question.
Let me address it, and I think it'll get to your second question. The intelligence community reached the conclusion that the Russians did it, and not just that they did the hacks of the DNC, but they also, and the Podesta emails, but they also dumped them. And that they had a multifaceted campaign to disrupt our election. That has now been ratified by Robert Mueller in his indictment of the Internet Research Agency and the social media campaign that the Russians waged to sow discord in the American electorate. And most importantly, it's now been ratified by the Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee. For even while they said, after looking at all the intelligence, that they couldn't find anything, there was nothing to see about collusion between Trump and the Russians. If you read the fine print in their findings just last week, they say, yes, the Russians actually did this. And not only did they do the hacking, but they also dumped the emails through Russian state online activists and third-party intermediaries, i.e. WikiLeaks. So that which was most in contention during the campaign, that the Russians were behind it, has now been ratified by everybody who looked at it. And I'll say one more thing. You raised Iraq and the flawed intelligence in Iraq. You raised that. Good question. We wrote a whole book about it. But when we wrote a book about it, excuse me, sir, when we wrote a book about it, we pointed out that there were dissents throughout the intelligence community from the get-go about everything the Bush White House was claiming about the ties about Iraqi WMD and the ties to al-Qaeda. Guess what? There have been no dissents from within the U.S. intelligence community at all about the conclusions that were reached. Nobody has come forward and said, guess what? They got it wrong. No, I have the evidence that they got it wrong. There isn't a single whistleblower who has come forward to indicate that. And so I think at some point, when everybody who looks at the intelligence reaches the same conclusion, you got to accept that as settled fact.
Okay.
Yeah, well, it's settled fact, sir. Next question.
Move on.
Great. So I'm a big fan.
Thank you.
I like to say your legacy is a monument to professional journalism, or ought to be the right way of doing journalism. Having said that, I would like to ask you.
Whoa, all right. This
Here
is for
comes the
him.
curveball.
No. I really mean it.
Yeah.
To turn an introspective lens at the journalistic profession.
Mm-hmm.
The gentleman mentioned the Iraq War and the coverage leading up to the Iraq War. Judy Miller and New York Times story.
Yes.
The excessive coverage of Donald Trump that led, virtually by most acknowledged experts, to his election, and the failure of the professional journalistic profession to be even-handed in the coverage of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Would you accept the premise that the journalistic profession needs oversight, that we need to have some sort of code of ethics where professional journalism is overseen by a board of peers, perhaps?
Okay.
Where
I think we see where you're going with this, and I would say obviously no, but I accept But I accept you. But no, let me agree with your premise, though. I agree with your premise. We wrote about the failure of the media to cover the run-up to the Iraq War and the misrepresentations and lies from the George Bush administration and hubris. And we talk in this book, too, about how, at least in one or two instances, the media didn't really get the Russia story. And there was actually a lot out there, again, hiding in plain sight. One good example was October 7th. The administration puts out a statement in the name of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Homeland Security saying that our intelligence conclusion is that the Russians are doing this. That was, in some ways, a major development. The United States accusing the Russians of interfering covertly in our election. Now, something else happened that day. Some of you have read that chapter. That was Access Hollywood tape. And something else happened that day. That was the John Podesta email started coming out. And I do think that the media did not frame it up right. The political reporters covering the Clinton campaign, and I don't blame them for this, became obsessed with each bit of data in those emails that came out every single day for 4 weeks, 2,000 emails. And they'd ask about this Clinton person hating that Clinton person, or asking about her bank speeches that she wouldn't release. They're all important things to cover. But the media itself didn't get the bigger picture, that this was an act of warfare, information warfare, very sophisticated. And one of the tragedies in our book is that the Clinton campaign kept trying to make that point, and they kept wanting the White House to emphasize that point. Now, they were in a bad position because they're a political campaign. And when they were making that point, reporters were saying, that's just spin, deflection, distraction, and now tell us why Chelsea Clinton is upset with Doug Band, who works for Bill Clinton. And so they were in a really tough spot. But, Mike, I know speaking for us, we spent a lot of September and October trying to chase that story down and whether there was an FBI investigation. It was very hard to do. But in retrospect, I think the media learned some lessons from the Iraq War. I hope they learned lessons, certainly the French media learned from us, and it covered the French leaks in their presidential election a lot differently than ours. So that's what you do. You got to learn from mistakes. I don't think any of us wants a board overseen by whoever.
A shout out to David. Blonde Ghost was a wonderful book, and I hope it goes back into print soon. One of Vladimir Putin's current covers is defender of the Russian Orthodox faith. Do you have any indication that his minions reached out to Catholic conservatives or Christian conservatives?
There was actually quite a bit of that, and we write about it in the book. In fact, the two characters I mentioned earlier, Marina Butina and her boss, Alexander Torshin, were trying to arrange a summit between Trump and Putin in Moscow that would be under the rubric of a world summit on the persecution of Christians that would be presided over by Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham, who Trump bonded with during his birther days. Franklin Graham expressed the same doubts about Barack Obama's birth certificate that Donald Trump used to raise. And so the whole conservative Christian connection was very real. And one of the more interesting revelations in our book is we talk about how the U.S. government had a secret source in the Kremlin in 2014 who was warning the government, the U.S. officials, a U.S. official, about Putin's plans for information warfare and hacking to undermine Western democracies. This was probably the most important revelation. But he also gave other insights into Putin and his court, and one of which he talked about was this Russian Orthodox monk, a bishop in the Russian Orthodox Church, extreme nationalist, extreme xenophobic, who had become, in effect, Putin's godfather, and was advising him and about how to appeal to what had become Putin's main constituency, which was the conservative nationalist strain in Russian life, which was very real and in some ways resembles that in the United States. So yes, there is a real interesting connection there.
Hi, yeah. You mentioned Azerbaijan. I wanted to ask about this little deal that the Trump Baku, this hotel in Azerbaijan that Ivanka was overseeing, and then it was sort of dropped in 15. It was sort of like a bridge to nowhere. It was a hotel in a strange part of town. But anyway, did any of those side deals by the Trump children play into the story, and do you think they'll have any liability?
Well, I'm proud that Mother Jones was the first to write about this hotel deal that Trump tried to do in Baku, but I have to also inform you that the best story on this was in the New Yorker. They were really in-depth story that if you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. I think by Adam Davidson, so he deserves a lot of credit for this. And it was remarkable in its telling because it seemed to be emblematic of how they do business overseas. They were working with a corrupt regime that even had connections, some of the builders in this project, to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. I mean, it sounds almost too unbelievable. And, you know, they probably violated numerous sections of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I remember the best quote in the article, in the New Yorker article, was somebody who said, the way the Trump organization conducts due diligence is to see if the check clears. And, you know, they went, you know, they were continually going around the world, cutting corners, you know, whether it was in Latvia. And I have, you know, having spent a lot of the last 2 years with people on my staff, including a great reporter named Russ Choma, trying to penetrate the opaque nature of the Trump business world, I'm convinced that we've just really skirted the surface here, and that there's still a lot out there. I mean, you know, we have all the statements they've made, and we go into this in the book, about Russian investment and how important Russian money was to them. And I still don't think we have a full understanding of that. And we know many times they've been sued, and we know there was even a criminal action that was considered by Cyrus Vance Jr., the DA in New York City, that ended up not going through for some unusual reasons. So, I mean, it could well be, and this is what people are wondering, if Mueller's going to start looking at this. There's the very odd relationship between Donald Trump and the private side of Deutsche Bank, which, coincidentally or not, got involved in a $10 billion Russian money laundering scheme. And any reporter who works in this can tell you that, you know, you hear lots of rumors about Russian money and other things involved in deals like this. But the bank secrecy laws are incredibly tight. It's very hard to get to the bottom of.
Hello.
Hello.
So kind of walking through the chronology today, it kind of started with, from what I heard, Trump's desire to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, kind of being somewhat of a catalyst at the beginning of some of these events. Why was he so set on having a Trump Tower in Moscow? Like, why Moscow out of everywhere in the world?
For reasons that you know, may be psychological as much as anything, but he seemed to, I mean, this goes back many years. I mean, he was trying to do business in the old Soviet Union in the 1980s under Gorbachev. It became almost an obsession of his. You know, it is true that a lot of Russians were flocking to Trump Tower and Trump developments around the country, not just Trump Tower in New York, but elsewhere, buying properties. So, you know, it became a source of cash for his business. But I think it was also like, you know, just sort of basically, as I said, psychologically, you know, it was something he hadn't been able to accomplish. So, you know, that which he wasn't able to get before, you know, when he saw he had an opportunity to do it, became that much more desirous for him.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Mike, I'm a retired firefighter, so I spent 27 years in the fire department, but so I have a lot of time to sit around and watch MSNBC all the time, so I kind of follow this stuff a lot. But
You've probably noticed us on the...
Yeah,
Once or
that's why I'm
twice.
here. That's why I'm here. But I'm also married. I've been married for 25 years. I'm an unapologetic, lifelong Democrat. My husband is a Trump Republican.
Whoa.
Don't ask me how it works. It just does. I won't lie.
I assume you have another TV in the house for him to watch.
You know, Fox and Friends is on in the kitchen. Morning Joe is on in the living room. It's every single day. But
You ever see each other? How does this work?
this has probably put more stress than any other time in our marriage. But this is my question. Both as a lifelong union member, I grew up in West Virginia. My father was a coal miner. My mother worked for the Postal Service. I'm an absolute unionist. Actually, before I was here, I was at Busboy and Poets. They were doing so the West Virginia teachers were there talking about their successful strike, so that was way cool. But my question to you is this, because I know a lot of firefighters who are reasonable, sensible people who voted for Trump. My husband is a reasonable person. West Virginia supported Trump. These are reasonable people. So my question is, as we move forward, assuming everything in your book is true, all the allegations are true, the midterms go in the favor of the Democrats, President Trump gets impeached, how do we as a country move forward? Because however you want to slice it, 40% thereabouts believe in President Trump. These are reasonable people, and they're self-identified as patriots. So now we're going to have them accept the fact that they were actually Russian co-conspirators in this whole thing. So I'm very scared for our country and how it could digress.
I think those are reasonable fears. I don't think the number is 40%, but it's probably maybe closer to 33%. But they are very passionate, as you probably see every day. You know, and you know, we live, and Trump knew this in a way. I mean, he's not always the brightest, but he is masterful in understanding how media and celebrity works and how to message. You know, and he knew he was talking to people, and it's kind of cynical. I talked to people in his campaign, during the campaign. They said, we're just reaching people through headlines. Through headlines. Lock her up, build a wall, make America great. And they didn't really care what came after that. That was a strategy for them. And so they were reaching people on what they will tell you was an emotional way, forging a bond emotionally. And it's really hard to tell someone when they feel an emotional bond that you're wrong.
Or that they've been manipulated.
Or that they've been manipulated. No one wants to believe they've been manipulated. You know, that's one of the arguments they make. Well, you know, you're saying the American voters are so stupid that they were, you know, they were manipulated by whatever the Russians did. And you know, Trump, you know, heightened the sense of division. That's part of his strategy. And it's going to, you know, and should he come to pass at some point, either prematurely or on schedule, it's going to be, I think, a very hard bridge to walk across, because our media and the way we talk about these things now has followed the same divisive lines. So you're going to be watching Morning Joe, who will be celebrating. Your husband will be sobbing in his beer with Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson. And so you tell me, this is the microcosm. How do you just reconcile that within the confines of a house, let alone how do we resolve that with people in Washington and people in Idaho and people in Louisiana, people in Maine? I think it's going to be a very big challenge for our nation's leaders to figure out where to go from this point. I don't know if you are more optimistic than I am, Mike.
No.
We're going to take 2 more questions, and hopefully they'll have optimistic answers.
Well, I don't know about optimism, but I was wondering where you thought Wilbur Ross fit into all of this, the Commerce Secretary.
Excuse me, I didn't hear that.
Where Wilbur Ross fits into all of this, the Commerce Secretary?
Oh, Wilbur Ross's role in all this?
All the Russia, I mean, the Cyprus
Well,
Bank.
he was the top official at Cyprus Bank.
Working with a Russian oligarch.
Working with a Russian oligarch. It is interesting, you know, when you take a step back, you know, how is it that Trump selected the people that he did? And, you know, from Michael Flynn, who had flown over to Moscow on the Russians' dime to celebrate the anniversary of RT, the Russian propaganda station, and sits next to Vladimir Putin at the celebratory dinner. Carter Page, who had this, you know, worked in Moscow and was basically a Putin apologist, becomes a member of the Foreign Policy Advisory Team. You know, George Papadopoulos, who another Foreign Policy Advisory Team who gets cultivated by these Kremlin cutouts. And
don't forget Tillerson.
Yeah, Rex Tillerson as his Secretary of State, who had done business with Putin. How is it that all these people who had these Russia connections, you know, flocked to Trump and Trump embraced? It's, you know, one of the things that makes this such a puzzling story, because it is true that there is no smoking gun that proves, as David was saying before, you know, a active campaign of conspiracy to collude during the election. That doesn't exist. And yet, when you look at, you know, all the dots that are there, it's quite a bit. And was all this coincidence that all these, you know, Putin-friendly people who had been, you know, co-opted, you know, by the Russians happened to all flock to Donald Trump's camp? You know,
you forgot one of the best ones.
Sure,
Paul Manafort.
Yeah, Paul Manafort.
But
of course.
Think about. I mean, any one of these could be a big headline scandal. Just this alone, Paul Manafort, campaign manager for one of the 2 people who could become president. At the same time he's managing Trump's campaign, he is dealing with a former business partner of his, or current business partner, it's unclear, who's been identified as a former Russian intelligence officer, and using him to send messages to a Russian oligarch, Oleg Deripaska, who Manafort owes money to, but who's close to Putin. I mean, that in itself is a movie. That's a limited series. You could get 7 hours out of that.
Yeah,
and in our book, it's 2 pages.
Well, we do have the reaction of Victoria Nuland, who is the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, when she learns that Manafort has become the campaign manager for Donald Trump. And the reaction is, Manafort, he's been a Russian stooge for 12 years. And like, how did that happen? Anyway.
Thanks.
I think our final question?
Yes.
Okay.
So, do you have any insight into the complicity of the rest of the Republican Party? Have you seen?
Oh, good question.
We talk about everybody who's associated with Trump and that he brought in, but how did he get all of these other people to follow what he's doing?
That's a really good question, because I get at least 1 email a day from someone who says, you know, what do the Russians have on Paul Ryan or McConnell or every other Republican in America?
I mean, tinfoil hat and all.
Yeah,
but,
you know, and I understand the impulse. I mean, it's, you know, because we do talk about compromise and the, you know, the importance of that in Russian political undercover operations. I think this is anybody's guess is as good as anyone else's. You know, my own, you know, personal view is that the Republican Party, its leadership, and most of the Republican Party has looked at the Republican base and decided that a good part of the base wants a cult of personality. It's not about ideology anymore. Trump can be, you know, strong on tariffs. He can back off of tariffs. He could threaten to attack North Korea. He could say he's meeting with North Korea. It doesn't really matter. And as long as they get, you know, their tax cuts, they've decided that Trump is the Republican Party, or is what most Republican primary voters want, and they are going to go along with him, which is why it was so discouraging to me. And you know, if any of you have watched me on television over the last couple of decades, you know, I can be partisan, I can be ideological, but at the same time, I feel naive. I feel that the Republican reaction to this attack on America that interfered with our sacred elections, you know, their approach to this has been something that I never would have expected. I thought there was an obvious play here. It didn't affect the outcome, but we can't let this happen again. We're going to have a vigorous investigation and put up the safeguards and, you know, protect what we all share. And that was kind of what they said at the very, very, very beginning after the election, a few Republican leaders. But when push came to shove, when Trump kept denying it was it was anything real, kept calling it a witch hunt, and we have a great story in the book about how he came up with that phrase, and they saw this playing on Fox News and the conservative media, I just don't think Paul Ryan, McConnell, most of them decided to row in a different direction.
I'd just like to broaden the answer a little bit because I agree with what David said, but I do think there's a larger point about the tribalism of American political life at this point. Mm-hmm. And yes, you can see it in the Republican reaction to Trump and the aversion to distancing themselves from him or saying anything too critical, because he did, after all, win the White House and carry them to victory. But I see it on the other side as well. It certainly was true during the Clinton years, the resistance of Democrats to say anything critical of Bill Clinton, and even when there were, you know, in my view, quite egregious abuses, not just on his personal life, but also on his campaign fundraising and other matters. And you can see it on all sides. When you have a country where, as in, you know, the woman's household, you know, one side is watching MSNBC and the other is watching Fox News and getting two different realities, it's really hard to bridge the gap or for anybody to dissent from the tribe that they're in, because we're all in our own tribes and you know, we stand by our tribal leaders, and that's an unfortunate development that's only gotten worse in the last few years.
But the book is great. You know, people say it reads like a spy novel, a thriller. And we've gotten requests from members of Congress to read the book. And in any event,
we also have requests to sign it.
We've been signing books.
Talking.
And anyway, but thank you for coming. Those of you who bought the book or read the book, thank you so much for supporting it.